The carceral state.
Hi friends. So in today's video, which is going to be it's going to be a longer lecture on the carceral state and the importance of understanding carceral state uh, for us as a global community to address the socio-ecological crises. And I did a short to sort of explain before to conceptualize, rather simplify what I meant by or what I understood by the carceral state, where I define the carceral state as a state that uses the criminal force of law to clamp down on any form of dissent or defiance. So, in this rather long lecture, as usual, I'm going to read out my notes that I've made from my reading of different post colonial scholars' works, uh, depending on uh, the works of Indian scholars and the works of Ugandan post colonial scholars, and also many other countries. So, yeah, back to the matter of fact. And so, so the reason why I was motivated personally to do this, to conceptualize the carceral state in relation to addressing climate and planetary crises more generally, is because what I noticed is that upon returning to India after completion of my PhD in the Netherlands in climate change adaptation, I was sort of reminded of the critical gap in how climate and environmental problems, legal research, and solutions were taught in the classrooms and discussed outside of classrooms as well. Dominant pedagogical or teaching related approaches to climate crises in Western universities remained, in my view, largely detached from the political violence unfolding across the global south. These approaches often ignore the repression of religious, ethnic, racial, and ideologically marginalized groups. Many of these groups challenge Western exclusionary and extractive models of citizenship and capitalist notions of development. Citizenship here broadly refers to legal membership into a state that is now popularly imagined as the nation state, through which individuals are granted rights as well as responsibilities. So, climate and environmental education frequently relies too heavily on the role of the state as a solution, without recognizing that states across the globe are increasingly criminalizing their own citizens, especially the racialized populations who contribute the least to the planetary crises. Those targeted are often the very communities fighting for the social and environmental justice. In countries like India, for instance, the systematic incarceration of scholar activists, environmental defenders, and advocates of inclusive citizenship is often dismissed as an aberration or a footnote within climate justice and international legal discourse. So, what is the problem with this kind of conceptualization of climate just solutions? So, what I argue is that the separation of everyday violence and politics from climate solution obscures a fundamental truth of the post colonial condition, that is, repression of freedom of expression and dissent, is not an exception but a structural barrier to socio ecological justice. Now, this barrier has deep colonial roots and has been sharply intensified under contemporary authoritarian capitalist Hindutva majoritarianism. Public violence, including systemic sexual violence against Dalit and indigenous or Adivasi women, mob lynchings of Muslims and Dalits, and the routine impunity granted to perpetrators demonstrates how carceral culture operates through fear as a governing logic beyond formal institutions of punishment. As sociologist Mohua Bandyopadhyay argues, carceral culture includes the norms, attitudes, and practices of fear that shape not only prisons but also the wider regimes of surveillance, discipline, and confinement that extend far beyond the prison walls. Carceral culture includes the regulation of bodies and citizens across multiple sites or spaces. So, this understanding of carceral culture allows us to recognize that criminality extends beyond formal criminal justice institutions into public spaces, where everyday violence, surveillance, and impunity operates as forms of social control. This violent culture operates through pervasive surveillance, persecution, and policing of minorities, especially. It also targets any citizen who challenges the ideological foundations of Hindutva politics, ethno nationalism, and Hindu Brahminical patriarchy. These systems are further sustained by capitalist development that relies upon environmental destruction and the exploitation and expropriation of the peasant populations and their subsistence and ancestral lands. So then, the carceral state becomes a state that uses the force of criminal law and criminality to clamp down on defiance and political dissent by weaponizing collective fear and modes of silencing. The carceral state operates not just through criminal law, but also through quasi-criminal systems, including immigration and juvenile legal regimes that mirror criminal law in their institutions, processes, and punitive consequences. Empirically, this logic is evident in the governance of resistance of environmentally destructive projects and in citizenship laws that frame religious, racial, and ethnic minorities and stateless refugees like the Rohingyas as infiltrators and the Adivasis or the indigenous communities as backward and enemies of national development. So, latest research by a civil society organization called the Global Witness documents the growing criminalization of land and environmental defenders across Asia through arrest, detention, and weaponization of the law. In India, nearly 78% of prisoners are under trials, with Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims disproportionately represented, despite them forming just minority of India's population. Criminalization thus operates not just as an exception but as a routine technique of governance and control mobilized to silence resistance to extractive development and majoritarian cultures in various countries. And Amnesty International notes in its report titled India, Free Umar Khalid, Stop Invoking Counterterrorism Law to Silence Dissent. And I quote from the report. In December 2019, the Bharatiya Janata Party BJP-led government introduced the Citizenship Amendment Act. The law explicitly discriminates on the basis of religion by excluding Muslims from expedited access to citizenship and from legal protection against deportation and detention. The passage of the Citizenship Amendment Act, alongside the proposed National Population Register, triggered nationwide peaceful protests amid fears that millions of Muslims could be rendered stateless. End quote. These peaceful protests were followed by communal violence, yet, instead of arresting the perpetrators of the riots, the police targeted and incarcerated several student activists, including Umar Khalid from Jawaharlal Nehru University in India's capital of New Delhi. On 13th December 2020, Umar Khalid was falsely charged under an array of serious offenses, including sedition, murder, unlawful assembly, and promoting enmity between religious groups, despite the absence of credible evidence. Since 2020, he has remained incarcerated as an under trial prisoner, with bail applications consistently rejected by both the High Court and the Indian Supreme Court, as recently as 5th January 2026, because the state fears his potential to revolutionize the minds of the dispossessed populations. Crucially, Umar Khalid was not only a Muslim minority rights activist, but he was also an Adivasi or indigenous rights activist, revealing how the state collapses multiple forms of dissent into the simplistic and illogical category of anti-national. He is a social justice advocate and a curious anti-colonial scholar, just like me. In his PhD thesis titled Contesting Claims and Contingencies of Rule, Singhbham from 1800 to 2000, Umar Khalid examined the relationship between the Adivasis and the state, showing how indigenous systems of self-governance of the whole community were co-opted into colonial governance structures, strengthening existing hierarchies and forming new ones. To understand these patterns of state-sponsored violence against political dissent, we must turn to India's colonial inheritance and colonial roots rather. The British divide and rule policies and draconian laws not only criminalized anti-colonial movements back then, but also institutionalized religious hate among the Hindus and the Muslims by governing Hindus and Muslims as separate political communities, eventually leading to pre-colonial India's partition along religious lines into East Pakistan, West Pakistan, and India. East Pakistan today is basically Bangladesh. This legacy continues to erode the subcontinent's multicultural fabric and shapes the architecture of the contemporary carceral state. At the same time, the incarceration of Adivasi and indigenous rights defenders, including Sudha Bhardwaj, Sonam Wangchuk, among many others, demonstrate that repression is not just limited to religious minorities, but also extends to Hindu majoritarian groups advocating for indigenous sovereignty, socialism, and substantive decolonization. So, incarceration, as we see, is nothing but a tool of governance that is not new to India. Since formal independence in 1947, it has been routinely deployed against Dalits, Adivasis, and ideological minorities who resist the violent statist and economic concepts inherited from European colonial modernity. What distinguishes the present moment is the intensification of repression under Hindu right-wing rule. This regime seeks to dismantle the multicultural Indian nation and collapse it into a Brahminical and patriarchal Hindu nation. Under this system, citizens who challenge Hindu majoritarianism, the European nation-state model, and hyper-capitalist modes of extractive growth and development are increasingly being placed under permanent suspicion through harassment, criminalization, surveillance, and incarceration. The pursuit of national development at all costs, enforced through the incarceration of dissent, reveals a deeper entanglement between coloniality, contemporary nationalism, state power, and violence. The modern nation state emerged alongside European colonialism as a political form premised on cultural homogeneity and a capitalist extractive economy. This model relies on dispossession, environmental destruction, and the institutionalization of violence to dominate both society and nature. Crucially, it produces a structural division between a national majority as the normative political subject or the standard and minorities as subordinate populations. As postcolonial scholar Mehmood Mamdani argues, this division is not accidental but embedded in the conceptual incompatibility between the nation as a concept and the state as a concept. So, while the state is a legal form tasked with applying the law equally to all its citizens, the nation is a political community that is organized around the protection of core members who identify with a homogeneous identity. The tension between the state and the nation is resolved not through equality but through exclusion of minorities. So basically, in Mehmood Mamdani argues that minorities are uh, the colonial modern state sort of creates permanent minorities, and it's not an accidental feature of the modern nation state, but it's an integral part of the modern post colonial state formation. So, post colonial states inherited this European nation state model along with colonial borders that erased ethnic plurality and directly and indirectly forced heterogeneous populations into a singular national identity defined by the majoritarian culture. As sociologist Nandini Sundar has further argued, minorities are compelled to quote unquote integrate into a dominant mainstream rather than being recognized as sovereign communities in their own collective right. International legal scholar Muhammad International legal scholar Muhammad Shahabuddin similarly demonstrates how post-colonial constitutional projects institutionalize homogenization, framing minority protections as temporary concessions and representing pluralism as a threat to territorial integrity, most notably during India's Constitutional Assembly debates. This logic reflects what Mehmood Mamdani identifies as the foundational compromise of the liberal nation state. John Locke's doctrine of toleration, which permits minority inclusion only on the condition that minorities relinquish claims to sovereignty and accept their political subordination. It is this European exclusionary notion of tolerance that became the foundation of the modern nation state, which post colonial countries inherited. This framework institutionalizes a political order in which minorities remain perpetually dependent on majoritarian goodwill, rendering equality as a false promise rather than an actual reality. Cultural pluralism, anti capitalist politics, and ecological resistance are then recast as threats to the nation rather than legitimate political projects. The Western nation state model therefore normalizes exclusion and repression while foreclosing the conditions necessary for environmental justice, multiculturalism, and ultimately democracy. Many argue that not all states are carceral and that their carcerality is limited to punitive criminal justice systems, often associated with authoritarian regimes. However, this assumption is misleading. The state is not equally carceral towards all citizens. Repression is selectively intensified against black, indigenous, and non white populations. Policing and jail authorities disproportionately criminalize these groups owing to their so called racial inferiority. White privilege and white supremacy continue to structure the global order. For this reason, understanding the state as an experience, as popularized by anthropologists like Veena Das, rather than the state being an abstract institution out there, is crucial. Individuals encounter the state through its practices such as policing, courts, and administrative authorities in ways that are deeply shaped by their identity, social status, and hierarchy. Examining these differential experiences with the state dismantles the illusion of a cohesive, neutral state and reveals how carceral practices actively structure citizenship itself. This insight has led me to draw on black abolitionist frameworks and critical political theory, which understand the nation state not only as uniformly experienced institution, but as a structure of violence disproportionately imposed on racialized populations. From this perspective, the forms of institutional discrimination faced by Dalits and black communities and the Adivasis are far more intensified than those that I, for instance, experience. At the same time, as a woman of color, I am more likely to face discrimination by the state as compared to that of a white man or a white woman. These perspectives show how the modern state enforces criminality unequally along racial lines. Resisting carceral state violence is indispensable to socio-ecological justice. The same legal and coercive infrastructures that criminalize dissent and govern minorities through surveillance and incarceration are those that drive environmental destruction and dispossession of indigenous and small peasants, forest, and subsistence lands. The contemporary rise in state sponsored criminalization of peaceful dissent through draconian and colonial laws such as the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act in India, justified in the name of anti nationalism or through false invocations of decolonization, used to consolidate majoritarian state power, is not a secondary issue in addressing the planetary crisis. Decolonization is not a project of cultural or civilizational supremacy, whether articulated through white supremacy or Hindu supremacy. Rather, decolonization is central to advancing climate and environmental justice without confronting the colonial foundations of carceral states, which is nothing but a post colonial situation. Across the globe, humanitarian and international development interventions risk reproducing the very relations of domination over both people and nature that they claim to dismantle, and the very relations of domination that led us to the planetary crisis in the first place. Abolitionist and post colonial critiques therefore demonstrate that dismantling carceral institutions and logics is not peripheral to achieving socio ecological justice, but it's a necessary precondition for imagining just, inclusive, and sustainable futures and forms of citizenship. So, friends, the essence of this video is to show that it is before looking at mechanisms of justice that starts from institutions like the state. It is important to understand how the state is increasingly making the very environmental defenders and the minority groups their own enemies. in the pretext of like anti-nationalism. And this is not just happening in India, this is happening everywhere. It's happening in the US, it's also happening in so many countries in Europe. And like I explained, the carceral logics of the state is not universally experienced by all communities. The racialized communities who are actually living within the planetary limits and who have contributed and who are contributing the least to the problem of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, etc., they are the ones being uh, they are the ones under increasing surveillance and incarceration, and carceral control by the state. So, for this reason, it is important to understand that in order for us to achieve socio-ecological justice, it is important to protect the racialized communities and other minority groups who are actually trying to who are who are actually uh, trying to forge very inclusive and sustainable forms of citizenship and the state also beyond our modern colonial understandings of the state, such as the nation state, and beyond modern colonial understanding of the citizenship. So we have to um, for for academics and policymakers, it's important to conceptualize the state properly without before thinking of how policies can improve the lives of the racialized communities and how policies can solve the planetary crisis as such. Without a proper conceptualization of the state and the contemporary problems, it's we will just be we will end up forging solutions that reinforce the very structures and the unequal structures that created this mess in the first place. So that's it from my end, and myself, Dr. Norita Roy Chaudhary, and I will see you for more videos. Probably the next one would be something on a resistant poetry that I read from some of the anti-colonial uh, scholars, activists, or depends on my mood. And that's it from my end. And stay safe. And yeah, ciao, bye, bye.